Have you ever heard of Spartacus, the gladiator who dared to challenge the most powerful empire of the ancient world? But what really happened during the revolt that shook Rome to its core? It wasn't just a battle of slaves against their oppressors. It was an epic struggle that made the heart of Rome tremble with fear. In this video, we'll dive into the real reasons that drove Spartacus and his followers to rise up against one of history's greatest empires and explore the unexpected events that shaped this rebellion. Stay with us until the end, because the story of Spartacus is far more than you might imagine. Let's uncover the truth behind his fight and how his defiance inspired generations to come. Night fell over the worn hills of Italy, where the winds carried whispers of ancient battles. A group of travelers gathered around a campfire, their shadows flickering over the land scarred by history. Among them, an old merchant with piercing eyes and a deep voice began to tell a tale that echoed like thunder in the memory of the empire. There was a time when one man dared to defy Rome, he said, tossing a twig into the crackling flames. A man who made senators tremble and exposed the fragility of the world's greatest power. His name was Spartacus. The fire cast a glow on the faces of the listeners. Among them sat a young legionary, newly recruited, and a runaway slave who kept his eyes lowered. Everyone knew the name Spartacus, but hearing his story told in the darkness of the night, far from the speeches of the Senate and the writings of Roman historians, was something else entirely. Rome called him a rebel, a traitor, the merchant continued. But to the thousands who followed him, he was a liberator. Spartacus was no ordinary man. He came from the wild lands of Thrace, where warriors were born under steel and learned to fight before they could even read. He didn't just survive the brutal training of the gladiator schools. He united those who had been thrown into the arena like beasts. He refused to be a slave, refused to fight for the amusement of the Romans. And when the moment was right, he and his brothers in arms rose up against their masters. The revolt began as a muffled cry within the walls of the gladiator school in Capua, but it soon became a roar that echoed across all of Italy. Slaves escaped en masse, peasants joined the cause, and the Roman legions, accustomed to swift victories, underestimated the power of those who had nothing left to lose. They say his warriors defeated entire armies with nothing but makeshift weapons and unstoppable fury, the merchant said with a smirk, his voice tinged with admiration. Spartacus proved that the oppressed could stand against their oppressors. But Rome could not allow the rebellion to continue. Alarmed, the Senate sent legion after legion to hunt down Spartacus and his followers. For 2 years, they defied the empire's rule, striking like ghosts, appearing and vanishing, winning impossible battles. And then, the end came. Surrounded by an unforgiving enemy, betrayed by the ambition of some of his own men, Spartacus led his final charge. The accounts say he fell fighting, never retreating. But his body was never found. Some believe he died there, among his people. Others say he escaped, vanishing into the mists of time. The old merchant studied his listeners. The young legionary swallowed hard, imagining what it must have been like to face that army of desperate men. The runaway slave, silent until now, gazed into the flames as if seeing the reflection of a rebellion still burning in his heart. Rome won the war, the merchant whispered, but it never erased his name. The travelers remained in silence. The wind howled through the trees, as if the spirits of those who had fallen still roamed the land. Spartacus was gone, but his legend would never be forgotten. Long before his name became a cry of defiance across the lands of Rome, Spartacus was just a boy born into a world of warriors. His homeland, Thrace, was a wild and untamed region, where mountains stood like natural fortresses and dense forests hid ancient secrets. There, men learned from an early age that life belonged to the strong, and that war was as certain as the rising sun. The Thracians were not an easy people to conquer. Their clans were scattered, each ruled by its own chieftains, and their traditions were older than the Roman Empire itself. They were hunters, master horsemen, and fierce close combat fighters. The Greeks called them barbarians, the Romans saw them as useful mercenaries, but among themselves, the Thracians considered themselves warriors of the land, sons of the mountains and steel. Spartacus was born into one of these tribes, and his childhood was shaped by the harsh realities of a nomadic life. From an early age, he learned to wield a spear and short sword, to ride swift horses, and to survive in the vast landscapes of his homeland. His parents, like many Thracians, believed in freedom above all else. To them, living under foreign rule was worse than death itself. Slowly, Rome began to extend its influence over Thrace. The Roman army, ever hungry for land and slaves, offered gold and promises to those who submitted, but unleashed fire and destruction on those who resisted. Entire clans were forced into service as mercenaries, fighting battles that were not their own, bleeding for an empire that would never see them as equals. Some historians believe that Spartacus was captured during one of these campaigns while still young. Others say he willingly enlisted in the Roman army, like many of his people, and fought under the empire's eagles. One thing is certain, he was never meant to obey foreign masters. His spirit was too strong to be broken. It was only the beginning of his journey. Before becoming Rome's most feared enemy, Spartacus would have to learn a harsh lesson. Once lost, freedom can only be reclaimed through blood and steel. Before raising his sword against Rome, Spartacus lived among the rugged hills and wild valleys of his homeland, tending flocks beneath the vast Thracian sky. The life of a shepherd was no easy one. The mountain cold was merciless, and storms could turn a peaceful night into a fight for survival. But in this harsh world, he honed the skills that would one day make him a leader and an unstoppable warrior. In the solitude of the fields, he learned to read the subtlest signs of nature. Faint tracks on the ground, the rustling of leaves in the wind, the shifting clouds that foretold a coming storm. He developed a fierce patience, capable of waiting for hours for the perfect moment to strike, whether to protect his animals from predators or to hunt for his own survival. He had no luxury for weakness. In Thrace, those who did not learn to endure did not live long. Wolves were a constant threat. They came under the cover of night, their eyes glowing in the dark, sniffing for easy prey. But Spartacus, still a boy, learned to face them with an improvised spear, alongside other shepherds who, like him, turned simple staffs into weapons. Every battle against these beasts sharpened his instincts. Every failed ambush made him wiser. Beyond the wild animals, there was an even more dangerous threat: invaders. The Thracian lands were frequently raided by rival tribes or Roman soldiers searching for slaves. Spartacus had witnessed, more than once, villages set ablaze and families dragged away to an unknown fate. Perhaps it was there, amidst the screams of despair and the smell of burning wood, that his hatred for Rome began to take root. The years as a shepherd shaped not only his physical endurance, but also his spirit. He learned that nature does not forgive the weak, and that to protect what is his, one must fight without hesitation. When he finally held a sword, his mind was already as sharp as a blade. He didn't know it yet, but fate was preparing him for something far greater. The life of a simple shepherd was about to be left behind. Spartacus's fate took a dark turn when the empire he so despised finally extended its claws over him. No one knows for sure how he was captured, but there are two predominant versions of the story. The first suggests that Spartacus took part in a revolt against Roman domination in Thrace. Like many of his compatriots, he refused to bow before the invaders and may have fought alongside warriors attempting to drive the Romans out of their lands. But Rome's war machine was relentless. The Republic's soldiers crushed the resistance, and the survivors were hunted like animals. Spartacus may have been one of those prisoners of war, chained and forced to march for miles to a slave market, where his strength and physique caught the attention of his captors. The second version of the story suggests that Spartacus served as a mercenary in the ranks of the Roman army. This wouldn't be uncommon, as many Thracians were recruited to fight for Rome, sometimes out of necessity, other times lured by promises of wealth. But something happened, perhaps an act of insubordination, perhaps an uncontrollable desire for freedom. He may have deserted, fleeing the legions and attempting to return to his homeland. However, Rome did not forgive traitors. When he was recaptured, his punishment was severe: slavery. Whether as a prisoner of war or a deserter, the result was the same. Spartacus was chained, beaten, and dragged into a world of servitude. He lost his name, his land, and his right to freedom. In Roman chains, he found not only the pain of submission but also the spark of a hatred that would one day set the heart of the Republic on fire. The march south to Italy was long and brutal. He and other slaves were forced to walk under the overseer's whips, barely fed and treated like mere cargo. Many did not survive the journey, but Spartacus endured. His muscles, forged in the hills of Thrace, bore the weight of the chains. His mind, hardened by nature's trials, refused to break. He didn't know it yet, but he was about to be taken to a place where his strength would be tested to its limits, where his fury would find an outlet. His destiny awaited him in the city of Capua, deep in the heart of Italy. There, in a gladiator school, Spartacus would cease to be just a slave and become a symbol of rebellion that would echo through eternity. Spartacus was sold as a slave in a bustling market, where men were evaluated like mere animals. His imposing physique caught the attention of a particular buyer, Lentulus Batiatus, the owner of one of the most renowned gladiator schools in Capua. To Batiatus, Spartacus was not just another slave. He saw in him a potential champion, a man whose strength could bring great spectacles, and consequently great bets. The gladiator school in Capua was a true training ground for death. Men captured in battle, condemned criminals, and even indebted citizens trained there, all destined to entertain bloodthirsty crowds in the arenas. The day began before sunrise with brutal exercises that pushed the weak to exhaustion. Those who couldn't keep up died. There was no compassion, only the law of survival. Spartacus quickly learned that a gladiator's life was a mixture of pain and spectacle. The instructors were ruthless, demanding strength, speed, and absolute obedience. Those who failed in training were punished with whippings, starvation, or worse. But Spartacus was no ordinary slave. He observed everything around him, absorbing every detail. He understood that he couldn't just survive, he had to stand out. And that's exactly what happened. During his early training battles, Spartacus displayed remarkable skill. He didn't just fight with strength, but with intelligence. His movements were precise, his strategy meticulous. He knew when to attack and when to retreat, frustrating his opponents until they made a fatal mistake. This caught the attention of the trainers, who began to see him as one of the most promising gladiators in the school. But something inside him never broke. While other gladiators accepted their fate, Spartacus kept the flame of rebellion alive. He had not forgotten the hills of his homeland, the fields where he had grown up, the freedom he once had. And he would never accept the humiliation of fighting and killing merely to entertain the Romans. Every strike he landed in training was a reminder that he did not belong there. Every time he raised his sword, he saw not just an opponent, but the empire that had enslaved him. And in his heart, a dangerous idea began to take root, an idea that would change history forever. Spartacus would not fight just to survive. He would fight for his freedom. Even within the walls of the gladiator school, where every man's fate seemed sealed by the brutality of the arenas, Spartacus never accepted his condition as a slave. He saw the fear in the eyes of the other gladiators, saw how many had already lost all hope. But he had not. In his mind, slavery was not an inevitable fate, but a prison imposed by force, and any prison could be broken. Every day, he carefully analyzed the school's structure, the guards patrolling the halls, their schedules, and even the supply of weapons. He knew that escaping was nearly impossible, But Spartacus also knew that he could accomplish nothing alone. So he began to bond with the other gladiators, especially those who, like him, had not completely surrendered to the system. Crixus, a fierce Gallic warrior, was one of the strongest in the arena and one of the most discontented. The Germanic Enemaus, strong as a bull, shared the same hatred for Rome. They, along with many others, had one thing in common: the desire to break their chains. Spartacus realized that the only way to escape was to join forces. But simply wanting to flee was not enough. They needed a plan. During training, he exchanged glances with his allies, small gestures that went unnoticed by the instructors but meant everything. He whispered words of hope at the right moments, reigniting the spirit of those who had nearly given up. Meanwhile, the oppression continued. The trainers forced the gladiators into brutal fights, sometimes unarmed, just to amuse themselves with their suffering. The slightest mistake could mean death. But Spartacus never reacted impulsively. He knew that the right moment had not yet arrived. On a suffocating night, as the winds of fate blew in an unexpected direction, a murmur spread through the dark corridors of the school. The revolt was about to begin. Night fell over Capua when Spartacus and his allies made their decision. The gladiators had gathered in secret, the tension palpable. For months, they had studied every detail of the school's routine, every weakness in its security, every gap they could exploit. Now there was no turning back. It all started in the dining hall. One of the Roman guards, accustomed to treating the gladiators like animals, mocked one of them and turned his back carelessly. That was his fatal mistake. In a swift movement, the man was immobilized and his sword was ripped from his hands. Before any other sentry could react, Spartacus and his companions had already seized kitchen knives and makeshift spears. Chaos erupted. Guards ran in all directions, alarms were shouted, but the gladiators were prepared. They had no armor, but they had the strength of desperation and years of training. Crixus and Enemaus led brutal assaults, while Spartacus maintained organization, ensuring no one was left behind. In the main courtyard, a group of Roman soldiers blocked the exit, but the gladiators were masters of close combat. They fought with everything they had, and every strike was fueled by their burning desire for freedom. When the dust settled, the soldiers lay defeated, and the school's gates stood open. Wasting no time, the fugitives ran beyond the walls of Capua, knowing the city would soon be on high alert. They headed toward Mount Vesuvius, a high and rugged terrain, perfect for a hideout. There, finally free from their chains, they took a deep breath. But Spartacus knew this was only the beginning. After their daring escape from Capua, Spartacus and the other gladiators sought refuge in the caves and forests surrounding Mount Vesuvius, a volcanic region full of cliffs and hidden trails where they could regroup. They were free, but not safe. They knew the Romans would not take long to send troops after them. However, what Spartacus did not anticipate was the massive support his revolt would ignite. News of the gladiators' escape spread quickly among the slaves and peasants working in the fields and plantations of the region. They, like the gladiators, were oppressed under the weight of the Roman Empire. When they heard of the daring escape, a spark of hope ignited in their hearts. The first to join Spartacus was a small village of peasants already discontented with Roman rule. They were simple men and women, but they had determination and were willing to fight for their freedom. Over time, more slaves and peasants, weary of their lives under Roman oppression, began to seek out Spartacus in the mountains. The formation of the rebel army was neither planned nor formal. It was a union of men and women driven by the need for freedom, by the pain of oppression. Spartacus, with his military experience and keen mind, quickly realized the need for organization. What started as a desperate and disorganized group of men soon transformed into a growing and disciplined force. With so many joining his cause, Spartacus began training his followers, dividing them into smaller, more agile units. He implemented tactics he knew to be effective, combining guerrilla warfare with the brute strength of his men. Each battle, no matter how small, strengthened the rebel army, not just in numbers but in morale. At first, the Romans scoffed at the rebels, dismissing their capabilities. But soon, they began to realize the growing threat. Spartacus was no longer just a runaway gladiator. He was a commander, the leader of a massive and unexpected army, and his power was only beginning to show. Mount Vesuvius, with its towering height and rugged terrain, had become the perfect refuge for Spartacus and his growing rebel army. He knew the landscape provided a crucial strategic advantage. The Roman troops, accustomed to open-field battles, would struggle to fight an enemy who knew the region intimately and used it to their advantage. Additionally, the volcano itself could serve as a natural barrier, hindering the advance of the Roman legions. However, life on the slopes of Vesuvius was far from easy. The caves provided shelter, but food was scarce, and the need to hunt and gather supplies made daily survival exhausting. Even so, Spartacus never allowed his men to lose hope. He knew survival on the mountain was not just about physical endurance, but also about maintaining the army's morale. For weeks, the rebels reorganized, replenished their strength, and prepared for what was to come. During this time, Spartacus enforced a strict training routine, sharpening their combat skills. He understood that their greatest advantage over the Romans was not brute force, but the ability to use the terrain to their favor. And when the Roman legions finally arrived, surrounding Mount Vesuvius in an attempt to crush the revolt, Spartacus already had a plan in mind. He knew the Romans, in their arrogance, expected the rebels to surrender, to flee, or to crumble under the overwhelming power of Rome. But Spartacus was not like that. As the Romans set up their camps around the base of the mountain, the rebels began moving silently through the night, using hidden trails along the steep cliffs. Spartacus led his men with precision, positioning them strategically. The Roman siege was about to become a trap. At dawn, the Romans believed the rebels were trapped. But instead of attacking head-on, Spartacus and his army descended from the heights of Vesuvius through an unexpected route, striking the Roman supply columns with deadly speed. The surprise was total. Faced with the rebels' fierce and strategic assault, the Roman legions were caught off guard, disorganized, and unable to react. Mount Vesuvius was not just a refuge. It was a natural fortress that allowed Spartacus and his followers to once again triumph over Rome's forces. The victory over the Roman legions at Mount Vesuvius was a turning point for Spartacus and his rebels. It was not just a battle won, but a lesson learned. Spartacus, now fully recognized as a leader, understood that while it was possible to defeat the Roman legions in isolated battles, the real key to survival and victory lay in strategy. Over the following weeks, Spartacus devised a bold plan. Instead of confronting Rome directly, he would wage a war of attrition. He knew Rome had a powerful and vast army, but he also understood that logistics and time could be his allies. He began striking where they least expected, always avoiding direct confrontations and instead destabilizing the empire from within. The Romans were beginning to realize they were not dealing with a disorganized band of runaway slaves, but with a growing and determined army. Spartacus, with his sharp strategic mind, knew that to defeat Rome, he needed more than strength, he needed endurance. Instead of advancing into the heart of Rome, he retreated when necessary, forcing his enemies to stray further and further from their supply lines and reinforcements. Moreover, Spartacus used his knowledge of the terrain to his advantage. The mountains and forests surrounding southern Italy were his natural allies. He exploited hidden trails and difficult terrain to move quickly and strike where the Romans least expected. Each successful attack not only weakened Roman forces, but also boosted the morale of his followers. With every victory, the rebel army grew, as more slaves and peasants joined the cause. Spartacus knew that his strength lay not just in numbers, but in how he used them. He was a master of asymmetric warfare, leveraging surprise and mobility to his advantage. This made the Roman legions slower and more vulnerable, while his rebel army moved like a sharp blade, cutting through enemy lines and vanishing before the Romans could react. Rome, despite its power, was being challenged in a way it had never imagined. The empire was in shock. An army of slaves, once despised warriors, was now defeating its legions with intelligence, speed, and courage. Spartacus' brilliant strategy was not just a method of battle, but a revolution against the system, proving that resistance could indeed prevail. Spartacus' resistance against Rome was beginning to take on legendary status. Each victory over Roman forces was not just a military defeat, but a direct blow to the empire's confidence. The once invincible Roman legions now found themselves constantly outmaneuvered by an army of slaves and peasants. The impact of these victories was felt across Italy, and the news spread rapidly. Perplexed and humiliated, the Romans sent more legions to stop him, but Spartacus' strategy was proving increasingly effective. Instead of engaging in direct battles, he focused on attacking isolated positions, always choosing the most advantageous terrain. On the plains, he used dense vegetation to ambush and surprise enemy troops. In the mountains, he exploited the rugged landscape to disorient the Romans and strike unexpectedly. One of his most significant victories was against one of Rome's most well-trained legions, a force specifically sent to eradicate the rebellion. With his strategic brilliance, Spartacus lured the Romans into a narrow valley, restricting their movements. Surrounding them from all sides, he crushed them in a battle that became a landmark of the war. The victory was overwhelming, and Spartacus' army continued to grow. Rome, humiliated, began to realize that Spartacus' uprising was no longer a mere slave revolt, but a serious threat to the empire. However, the Romans, always prideful of their military strength, had yet to grasp the true danger posed by Spartacus' resistance. Meanwhile, the rebel army, fueled by the spirit of battle and the promise of freedom, continued to advance, facing the Romans with courage and skill. Each victory by Spartacus not only weakened Rome's military might, but also ignited a spark of hope in the hearts of the oppressed. The rebel army was no longer just a band of runaway slaves. It had become a symbol of resistance, a reminder that even the lowliest could challenge the empire. Spartacus' fight was only beginning, but his early victories were shaping history in ways no one in Rome could have foreseen. With each successive victory and Spartacus' example of courage and determination, the rebel army rapidly expanded. Initially composed of a handful of gladiators, slaves, and peasants, the movement now found itself overwhelmed with new recruits. With every city they raided, more men and women, oppressed and desperate for freedom, joined the fight. Each Roman defeat made the cause more appealing, and the promise of liberation spread like wildfire. Spartacus, with his strategic mind, was not just a military leader, but also a skilled organizer. He understood that such a large army could not survive without structure and discipline. So he transformed his rebels into a cohesive force, where each man knew his place and his role. Though many lacked formal training, Spartacus molded them into a war machine, drawing from his own combat experience and deep understanding of the terrain. The rebel army was no longer just a chaotic mob. Spartacus implemented a series of battle tactics tailored to his men's abilities. He used his troops for swift and unexpected attacks, exploiting the weaknesses of the Roman legions, which were often unprepared for such maneuvers. The rebel forces also became highly specialized in ambushes, night raids, and using the terrain to their advantage. Beyond military strategy, the expansion of the rebel army brought about a shift in morale. Many of the recruits, once enslaved and subjugated, were now fighting not just for survival but for a greater cause. Spartacus had inspired his men not only with promises of freedom, but also with the belief that they were rewriting their own history, defying the empire that had oppressed them for so long. He was not just a leader, he was the embodiment of a revolution, one that transcended individual struggle and became a collective movement, a battle of all against all. The size of Spartacus' army began to draw attention in Rome, but more importantly, the empire was beginning to grasp the true magnitude of the threat. As the rebel forces grew, so did Spartacus' resources, weapons, and allies. He was not only winning hearts and minds, but also seizing lands, destroying Roman villages, and capturing more supplies. Before long, the Romans realized that the rebel army was not merely surviving, it was thriving. As Spartacus' rebel army gained strength, the Roman Empire trembled at the thought that a band of slaves might one day bring mighty Rome to its knees. The spirit of resistance was rising, and the growing size of Spartacus' army proved that his struggle was far from an isolated insurrection. He had become a force to be reckoned with, and Rome would have to face him once and for all. With his army now massive and growing stronger by the day, Spartacus made the bold decision to strike at the wealthy cities of southern Italy. He knew that to achieve true freedom, he needed to drain the wealth of Rome's senators and weaken the empire's resources. Pillaging Roman towns and cities was not just a strategic move, but also a way to boost the morale of his followers, giving them a chance to reclaim what had been taken from them under Roman oppression. The cities of southern Italy, which were centers of great power and wealth for the Romans, quickly became prime targets for the rebel army. Spartacus and his followers advanced upon these towns with astonishing speed, striking without warning and leaving destruction in their wake. Once thought to be impregnable, Roman fortresses crumbled like houses of cards before the unexpected force of the rebels. Spartacus knew that by conquering these locations, he would not only destabilize Rome's economy, but also inspire even more people to join the uprising. The plundering was not just about material wealth. The rebels freed slaves and peasants, offering them a chance to fight for a better future. With each city they took, more and more people flocked to the movement. The Romans were losing control, and Spartacus' army was growing in both numbers and strength. But the attack on the south was not without consequences. The sacked cities were directly tied to Rome's power, and the Senate wasted no time in responding. Spartacus knew that victories were important, but he also understood that the revolt needed more than just plundering and destruction. To him, each battle won was a step closer to forcing Rome to recognize the resistance as a real threat and possibly push it to negotiate. However, many of his followers, consumed by the spirit of vengeance, were beginning to lose themselves in chaos, looting indiscriminately. Spartacus knew he had to control this fury to maintain command over his army. Meanwhile, the spread of the revolt across the southern cities created an atmosphere of panic in Rome. Wealthy senators feared for their lives and their properties, feeling that the empire was on the verge of collapse. Spartacus, with his strategy of swift and precise attacks, was getting closer to weakening the very foundations of the Roman Empire. However, the risk of losing control over the growing rebel force increased with every city taken. Spartacus had to balance his ambition for freedom with the need to keep his men united and focused. Spartacus' relentless march through southern Italy was shaping the revolt in an irreversible way. He was not only dismantling Rome's oppressive power, but also forging a new kind of army, not just made up of gladiators or slaves, but of men and women from all walks of life, united under a common cause. Rome could no longer underestimate the danger it faced. The empire knew that something far greater than a mere slave uprising was at stake. The advance of Spartacus' army across southern Italy triggered an unprecedented wave of panic in the Roman capital. The Senate, once confident in its ability to crush any threat, now found itself desperate in the face of the immense power of the rebel leader. Reports of Spartacus' victories arrived in waves, bringing news of sacked cities, destroyed villages, and most alarming of all, the mass liberation of slaves. The empire was losing control of its own territory, and a sense of vulnerability spread like wildfire. The Romans, who had spent centuries dominating vast lands and defeating rebellious peoples, had never faced a threat so close to home and yet so unexpected. Spartacus was not just a gladiator. He was the leader of a revolt that embodied everything Rome feared. The loss of its authority, the fragility of its slave-based system, and the potential downfall of its greatness. In their growing concern, the Senate called upon its most experienced and powerful generals to handle the situation. But even they were uncertain about Spartacus' true strength. Rome was used to fighting foreign invaders, not its own oppressed slaves and citizens. Spartacus represented an internal revolution that challenged the very foundation of Roman power. The aristocratic class was particularly alarmed. Many senators feared that Spartacus might march on Rome itself, backed by thousands of growing followers, and seize the city. The mere thought of losing the capital to an army of rebellious slaves was inconceivable. But it was also becoming an increasingly real possibility. Panic was evident in the streets and halls of Rome, and debates over what to do were growing heated. In an attempt to protect the city, the Romans dispatched their most loyal legions, composed of seasoned soldiers, to block any advance by Spartacus. However, fear was palpable, and the Roman troops were far from prepared to face such an unpredictable yet cunning and relentless rebel army. Terror gripped the empire. Spartacus reaching Rome no longer seemed like a mere threat, but a real possibility. Yet the panic in Rome was not limited to those outside the city's gates. The Senate was divided, with some calling for more aggressive action, while others suggested that it might be time to consider negotiations. Rome had no clear strategy for handling the revolt, which was increasingly proving to be much more than a simple slave insurrection. It was a movement with a far greater power of mobilization. Meanwhile, Spartacus, hearing reports of Rome's growing fear, knew that his fight was far from just a battle of swords and shields. He was creating a wave of change in the Roman mindset, something Rome feared more than any enemy army, a shift in perception, power, and control. Spartacus' revolt was no longer just a struggle for freedom. It was a direct challenge to the very foundations of the Roman Empire. Panic in Rome continued to rise, and the empire found itself on an irreversible path, where the only way forward was to face him directly. As his revolt pressed on, Spartacus encountered a new challenge that threatened the unity of his army: internal divisions. The rebel force, a mix of slaves, peasants, and deserters, was constantly expanding. Initially, their shared desire for freedom was enough to unite them. But as their numbers grew and their victories multiplied, differing opinions emerged about what their next move should be. Crixus, one of Spartacus' most trusted commanders and a man of great strength, began to stray from his leader's strategy. Crixus and other radical followers wanted to march on Rome directly, seizing the moment while the city was gripped with fear. They believed that by storming the capital, they could end the empire once and for all, perhaps even seize control of the city itself. To Crixus, the goal was clear: overthrow Rome, destroy its symbols of power, and secure freedom for all the oppressed. However, Spartacus had a more cautious vision. He knew that to defeat Rome, he needed more than a direct assault on the capital. The Roman army was vast and highly trained, and attacking Rome meant risking a catastrophic defeat. To Spartacus, true freedom lay in escaping Italy, crossing the Alps, and finding a place where he and his followers could live free, far from Rome's oppression. He understood that the war would not be won with a reckless march on Rome, but with a well-thought-out strategy of survival and perseverance. Tensions between Spartacus and Crixus escalated, with the two leaders increasingly at odds over the path forward. Their disagreement reflected the growing diversity of thought within the rebel army itself. Many soldiers who had joined the revolt seeking vengeance and liberation were growing frustrated with Spartacus' hesitation to strike at Rome. They wanted immediate action, a decisive victory. The desire to destroy Rome quickly and end its tyranny was strong, but not everyone was prepared for the consequences of such a choice. Spartacus, on the other hand, worked to maintain the cohesion of his army, reminding his followers of their true purpose: freedom. He knew that the revolt could not devolve into a mindless pursuit of revenge, as that would only lead to more deaths and, ultimately, the collapse of their movement. His strategic vision compelled him to keep his men united, disciplined, and focused on the long-term goal. As tensions mounted, Roman generals, aware of the internal divisions within the rebel camp, began to plan their counterattacks more aggressively. The infighting among the rebels weakened their resistance against the empire, and Spartacus knew this was a critical vulnerability. He could not allow internal strife to undo everything they had fought for. The divisions affected not only leadership, but also battlefield tactics. Some groups, following Crixus' vision, began acting more recklessly, leading to heavy losses in certain battles. Others, still loyal to Spartacus, tried to maintain organization and discipline, avoiding direct confrontations with stronger Roman forces. These internal conflicts, though rooted in the diverse ideals within the rebel army, began to weaken the movement's strength. Spartacus knew that if he failed to unite his men, his chances of success would be drastically reduced. The differences among the commanders, which had once been mere tactical disagreements, were now turning into a real threat to the survival of the revolt. The Roman Empire watched with growing confidence, waiting for the right moment to crush the rebellion at its weakest point. With internal divisions threatening the cohesion of the rebel army, Spartacus realized he could no longer rely solely on brute strength and the fervor of his followers. Strategic conflicts began to dominate the battlefield, with rebel armies splitting apart, leading to a series of battles that, while brilliant, also exposed the weak points in Spartacus's leadership. After Crixus and his group separated, Spartacus took on the responsibility of maintaining unity among the remaining forces. But for him, the situation was becoming increasingly complex. The guerrilla strategy that had worked so well before no longer seemed as effective. Every victory he secured seemed to come at a greater cost. The loss of his allies, the exhaustion of his men, and most of all, the growing division among the rebels themselves. Spartacus would have to make difficult decisions, as the Roman army was not just waiting to strike, but also reorganizing and increasing the pressure. Meanwhile, Crixus and his followers, in a reckless move, faced the Roman legions in a decisive battle without Spartacus's presence. The result was catastrophic. Crixus's army was crushed, suffering heavy losses, and many of his men were either killed or captured. His defeat was a devastating blow to the morale of the rebel army. When Spartacus learned of his commander's downfall, he swore to avenge his friend's death, while also reflecting on the consequences of their internal disputes. The once united and motivated army now faced serious challenges, not only against Rome, but also against its own internal fragility. The impact of the defeat was profound, and Spartacus knew he could no longer fight as he had before. He needed to adapt his tactics. The war against Rome was no longer just physical, but also psychological. The Romans were becoming more cautious and calculated, while Spartacus mastered swift maneuvers and guerrilla attacks. He used the terrain to his advantage like never before, moving rapidly through Italy's mountains and forests, raiding Roman supply lines, and ambushing troops with remarkable skill. Every battle was now not just a fight for survival, but a struggle to preserve whatever strength remained. But the lack of unity was ever present. Spartacus's army, though still large, no longer had the same coordination as before. His bold and creative tactics were effective at times, but poor decisions and impulsive actions from other commanders often undermined his plans. Spartacus now found himself not just leading soldiers, but managing conflicting ideals and men who, despite their bravery, were beginning to lose faith in their cause. Time was also working against him. Rome, recognizing the weaknesses in the rebels' strategies, tightened its grip. Marcus Licinius Crassus, the Roman general summoned to crush the revolt, saw the rebels' internal struggles as an opportunity. He reorganized his legions, implementing siege tactics and blockades that forced Spartacus into increasingly difficult choices. Every rebel movement was being monitored and anticipated, and the lack of resources to sustain such a large army made the future seem ever darker. Spartacus knew he had to find a solution quickly. His options were narrowing by the day, and the weight of each decision was beginning to show in his men. The war was far from over, but the real battle was now for the survival of his army and the preservation of hope. Amid the chaos, he tried to reaffirm his leadership, drawing on the teachings of resistance and reminding his followers of what they were fighting for: freedom, dignity, and justice. But even the best tactics could not mask the growing vulnerability of the rebel army. The divisions among commanders and the lack of a clear objective were eating away at the foundations of the revolt. Rome was closing in, and with it, the end of Spartacus's great resistance. The empire knew the time had come to put an end to the uprising, and Spartacus, now more isolated than ever, had to confront the ghosts of his own strategic choices. The Roman Senate, gripped by panic over the growing threat posed by Spartacus and his rebels, was forced to take drastic measures. The empire, which had long dismissed slaves and deserters as insignificant, now found itself in a desperate struggle to prevent an unprecedented rebellion from shaking its foundations. Spartacus's uprising had reached alarming proportions, and Rome was racing against time to crush the resistance before it could spread any further. Aware of the magnitude of the threat, the Senate summoned Marcus Licinius Crassus, the wealthiest and most influential man in Rome, to take command of the Roman forces and ensure the rebellion was eradicated. Crassus, a shrewd and ruthless strategist, was determined to end the insurgency at any cost. Known for his brutality and ability to command legions with ruthless efficiency, he was the perfect leader to deal with Spartacus's growing menace. His appointment was not just a matter of necessity, but also one of prestige. His reputation as a commander was something he could not allow to be tarnished by a slave-led revolt. Soon, Crassus's legions spread across Italy, cutting off escape routes and isolating the rebels. Rome was now taking the threat of Spartacus seriously, and the restructuring of the Roman army was beginning to show results. Crassus adopted an uncompromising approach, employing siege tactics and blockades to prevent Spartacus from escaping north or fleeing overseas. With each strategic maneuver, he forced the rebels to regroup and move exactly where Rome wanted them, leaving them little room for movement. To ensure his victory was absolute, Crassus also introduced brutal measures to further break the rebels' morale. He did not hesitate to execute Roman soldiers who had fled or deserted in previous battles, a move to restore discipline within his ranks and send a clear message to the rebels. There is no place for desertion, no room for weakness. Every act of cowardice was met with swift punishment, and Crassus was determined to make his own men understand that failure was not an option. He also used captured rebels as an example, crucifying them along the roads, a cruel spectacle that served as both punishment and a warning to those who dared to continue the resistance. Crassus's legions closed in on the rebels. Spartacus, realizing that his room for maneuver was shrinking, intensified his guerrilla tactics, striking at strategic points and attempting to weaken Roman forces. But the Romans, now better prepared and more determined, were not so easily deceived. Every move Spartacus made was met with an increasingly fierce counterattack. Meanwhile, inside the rebel camp, tensions grew. Some, like Crixus, who had already broken from Spartacus's plan and sought direct confrontation with Rome, were now viewed with suspicion by those who still trusted Spartacus's leadership. The internal division that Spartacus had feared was now taking shape. But more than the disagreements among leaders, the greater problem was the very nature of the resistance. The spirit that had fueled the early days of the revolt was beginning to fade, replaced by the harsh reality of fighting against a professional army with overwhelming power. Crassus knew that time was on his side. Every move he made was not just about defeating Spartacus, but about dismantling the rebel movement from within. He wasn't just hunting Spartacus' army. He was crushing the very hopes of freedom it represented for his followers. And with each passing day, Spartacus knew their chances of success were fading. The inevitable confrontation with Rome was drawing closer, and the fight for freedom felt like a flame flickering out as the Roman Empire advanced with overwhelming power, determined to maintain its supremacy. As the pressure mounted and Crassus' legions closed in, Spartacus refused to surrender. His strategic intelligence and deep knowledge of the terrain became his greatest allies. He knew that facing the Roman forces head-on would be suicide, so guerrilla warfare became his only option. Using every corner of the Italian landscape, every hill, every forest, Spartacus became a master of swift maneuvers, striking at strategic points and vanishing before the Romans could react. His army, though largely composed of men without formal military training, had become a cohesive and disciplined force under his leadership. He taught his followers to strike without warning, ambush Roman supply lines, and make the most of the improvised weapons at their disposal. Guerrilla tactics were key to wearing down the Roman forces, who were accustomed to conventional battles, and Spartacus knew exactly how to exploit this weakness. Spartacus was like a shadow in the mountains and forests. He and his men moved under the cover of night, disappearing into the darkness only to strike with ferocity at dawn. He knew the terrain better than anyone. Every trail, every field, and every village became his weapons, and he used these advantages to disrupt Crassus' supply lines and weaken Roman morale. As Rome's legions marched, Spartacus' rebels were always one step ahead, ambushing troops, seizing provisions, and leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. He also understood how to manipulate time and geography to his advantage. When the Roman legions advanced, he retreated into mountains and inaccessible areas, forcing the Romans into long and exhausting marches. He knew that Crassus' forces were large, but also heavy and slow. By exploiting this weakness, he disrupted Roman communications and movement, forcing them to fight in conditions that favored the rebels. The rebel commander also had a keen understanding of his enemy's psychology. He knew that the Romans, with their rigid formation and discipline, were vulnerable when their communication and supply lines were cut off. Every attack Spartacus launched targeted these weak points, draining Roman morale and creating a constant sense of uncertainty. The Romans never knew when or where the next attack would come, and this became an ongoing nightmare for Crassus, who struggled to contain the elusive rebel leader. Spartacus also surrounded himself with a circle of loyal and shrewd commanders. Men like Crixus, who though sometimes separated from Spartacus, played a crucial role in the overall strategy. When his followers gathered to plan their next move, it felt as if nature itself was on Spartacus' side. The Romans, on the other hand, were in a constant battle against time and terrain, trying to pin down an enemy that seemed more like a force of nature than a conventional army. The war led by Spartacus became a true battle of nerves. Each attack was proof of his genius and his unwavering commitment to freedom. His followers saw him as more than just a military leader. He was a symbol of resistance, someone who had turned the fight against oppression into an art. And while Rome tried to crush that spirit, Spartacus pressed on unshaken, with an unbreakable resolve that defied all odds. Spartacus' revolt was gaining momentum, but like all great struggles, it began to show its first cracks. Crixus, one of Spartacus' most fearless and loyal commanders, had an unyielding warrior spirit. He believed that the only way to secure their people's freedom was to march on Rome and face it directly. While Spartacus, always the strategist, preferred to continue strengthening the rebel army through resistance, Crixus couldn't contain his thirst for battle. Convinced that a direct victory over Rome could determine the fate of the revolt, he decided to forge his own path. With an army of followers equally eager for action, Crixus set out to attack one of the Roman legions in open battle. Spartacus, concerned about the risks of such a move, tried to dissuade him, but Crixus had made up his mind. He believed that striking directly could weaken Imperial Rome and deal a decisive blow to the empire. Unfortunately for Crixus, his reckless approach soon proved disastrous. The Roman forces, under Crassus' experienced command, were more than prepared for the rebels' impulsive assault. The battle was brutal. The disciplined Roman legions swiftly surrounded Crixus and his army with precise coordination. The strategy of attacking Rome head-on, without the support of Spartacus' main force, failed to have the intended impact. Though Crixus and his men fought with unyielding courage, their lack of reinforcements and the overwhelming superiority of the Roman forces led to a crushing defeat. By the time the battle ended, Crixus had fallen, along with many of his men. News of his death spread quickly through the rebel camp, delivering a devastating blow to morale. The rebel army had lost not only a brave commander, but also a powerful symbol of resistance. Crixus had been one of the first to believe that freedom could be won through sheer force, but his death left a leadership void, and the sense of loss threatened to weaken the rebellion. Spartacus, shaken by his allies' death, made a difficult decision. He knew he had to act fast, or Crixus' defeat could signal the end of the entire uprising. In a calculated move, Spartacus orchestrated a fierce act of vengeance. He rallied his remaining forces and, fueled by the pain of their loss, struck back with unmatched fury. The battle that followed was a testament to Spartacus' resilience. He crushed a Roman legion with a stunning display of strength, sending a clear message that Crixus' death would not be in vain. Yet, the loss of Crixus was not something that could be easily overcome. More and more, the rebellion seemed to be unraveling, with internal divisions and the weight of grief spreading among the fighters. Spartacus, now more isolated than ever, began to realize that winning freedom would take more than victorious battles. It would take unity and determination. As the echoes of Crixus' death lingered in the minds of his men, the shadow of Rome loomed closer, relentless and determined to crush the revolt. Crixus' death had not only weakened Spartacus' forces, but also marked the beginning of a period of deep reflection for the rebel leader. He knew that the final victory would not come without sacrifice. The rebel army, now fully under Spartacus' command, was stronger than ever. But despite their triumphs, uncertainty hung in the air. Spartacus, always calculating, understood that the fight for freedom could not be won through brute force alone. After the painful loss of Crixus, the burden of leadership weighed heavier on his shoulders. He had lost one of his finest commanders and feared that if they remained in southern Italy, the revolt would eventually be suffocated by Rome. Something had to change. It was then that Spartacus, with his sharp mind, made a decision that would define the future of the rebellion. He resolved to lead his men north beyond the Alps, to escape the reach of Rome's legions and seek lasting freedom far from the empire's iron grip. Crossing the Alps, a monumental task, was more than just a retreat. It was a strategic move, a masterstroke that could alter the course of the revolt. The rebel army, though victorious, was exhausted. The march would be long and difficult, and many of the rebels had doubts. Italy, with its fertile lands and wealthy cities, offered them a home and a future of freedom. But the possibility of facing Rome head-on, or worse, being crushed by the military might of the city, made the north, with its unexplored territories, a promise of freedom that could not be ignored. The march north began in silence, with Spartacus's men aware of the significance of what they were about to do. The path was arduous and fraught with dangers. Impassable mountains, swift rivers, and dense forests. These natural barriers made the crossing extremely challenging. Furthermore, the Roman legions were behind them, pressing ever harder, determined to crush the revolt before it became a larger threat. Spartacus, however, was a master of terrain. He used his knowledge of remote trails and hard-to-reach areas to evade the large Roman armies following them. Every step in the journey north was taken with fierce determination. The commander knew that if he could cross the Alps, his chances of success would increase significantly. It wouldn't just be a matter of escaping. It would be about ensuring that the revolt survived and eventually triumphed. But as the march progressed, problems began to multiply. The rebel army was divided. Many of his followers, still in shock from the loss of Crixus, wanted to fight, to continue resisting the empire, while others began to question the need to march farther into distant lands. The pressure on Spartacus increased, and he realized his authority was being tested like never before. Moreover, hunger and fatigue began to take their toll. The crossing of the Alps would not be easy. Winter was approaching, and the men, already exhausted from previous battles, needed provisions. Without a clear plan for the future, many began to question Spartacus's strategy, and a trail of uncertainty spread among the men. The march north, which had initially seemed like the key to freedom, soon turned into a survival dilemma. Spartacus tried to maintain the cohesion of his army, but internal tensions were rising. Some of his more impatient followers wanted to turn and attack Rome directly, while others, more cautious, preferred a more gradual plan. The road was growing harder with each passing day. Every decision made by Spartacus could be the last chance to secure victory. The choices he made now would determine not only the fate of his revolt, but also the future of his men. And as the Roman forces drew closer, Spartacus knew time was running out. The empire, with all its power, would not allow the revolt to survive much longer. He needed to act quickly, but doubt hung over him, as did the shadow of death threatening each of his steps. The march north could be the key to victory, or it could be the end of everything. And as the mountains loomed on the horizon, the battle for Spartacus's freedom was far from over. The march north, with its hopes and doubts, soon revealed itself to be an insurmountable dilemma. Rome, even with its immense military strength, was aware of Spartacus's movements. The rebel army, which had once seemed an unbeatable force, now found itself surrounded by a no-win scenario. The climb through the mountains and the flight to unknown lands had led the rebels into a natural trap, where the hope of escape was becoming more and more distant. The Roman general Crassus, relentless and astute, saw the opportunity to put an end to the revolt once and for all. He had been tasked with crushing the rebellion, and he knew this would be his last chance to bring peace to Rome. Without hesitation, he formed a siege around Spartacus's army, blocking all escape routes and preventing any possibility of resupply. Spartacus, with his sharp instincts and combat experience, tried to find alternatives. He knew the only chance to avoid defeat was to negotiate a favorable surrender, perhaps an agreement that would grant freedom to his men. For several nights, he met with his top commanders, discussing strategies, but as the siege closed in, options became increasingly limited. Crassus's legions were in every direction, and the prospects of a successful escape were almost non-existent. In those days of desperation, Spartacus sent emissaries to Crassus, offering surrender in exchange for his men's freedom. He knew that Rome would never accept a genuine peace offer, but the circumstances forced him to try. Spartacus's pride, which had led him to challenge Rome for so long, now clashed with the harsh reality of the siege. He understood that his struggle was about to come to an end. Crassus, however, had no intention of negotiating. For him, Spartacus's defeat represented not only the destruction of a threat, but also the reaffirmation of Roman power. The response Spartacus received was a cruel blow: refusal. There would be no deals. The only possibility of escape was total surrender, and Rome would accept nothing less. With the siege in place, the spirit of Spartacus's men began to fragment. The fear of imminent death spread like a plague among the rebels. Some soldiers, eager to save their lives, began to argue among themselves, while others were simply exhausted. Spartacus, always a strong and determined leader, tried to maintain morale, but he knew the end was near. Crassus's legions, relentless and disciplined, began to close in on the rebel camp. The sound of Roman marches became more and more prominent with each passing hour. Spartacus made one last effort to rally his men for the final battle. He called upon his most loyal warriors, and with renewed determination, ordered them to prepare for combat. But at the same time, Spartacus knew the confrontation would be unequal. The overwhelming strength of Rome was about to descend upon them, and the resistance, however fierce, would not be enough to prevent the end that was fast approaching. The battle that followed was brutal. Spartacus fought with unwavering courage, but the number of Romans was overwhelming. The fight was not only for survival, but for the memory of the revolt, for the honor of his men, and for the freedom he had promised but would never be able to give. In the heart of the battle, as the resistance of his men dwindled, Spartacus was last seen commanding his soldiers with the same bravery that had brought him this far. His body, however, was never found. It is said that he fell in combat, but the silence surrounding the final fate of the rebel leader left a veil of mystery over his death. Some believe he was captured, others that he sacrificed himself to ensure the escape of his men, but what really happened remains uncertain. The final siege not only meant the physical defeat of Spartacus and his army, but also the loss of a symbol of resistance that would inspire generations. With his death, the Roman Empire seemed to have finally crushed any threat to its supremacy. But the flame of resistance, ignited by Spartacus, would continue to burn in the hearts of the oppressed for centuries, reminding all that the struggle for freedom is never in vain. The story of Spartacus was not just a military defeat, but the birth of a legacy that would span the ages, inspiring those who rebel against oppression, even when all odds seem lost. The flame of his resistance, though silenced, would never be extinguished. Spartacus's last stand, and that of his men, was a battle of epic proportions, a clash that would echo through the annals of history as an example of bravery in the face of adversity. However, no matter how natural a leader Spartacus was, the battle unfolding before him was not an equal struggle. Rome's strength was overwhelming, and General Crassus, with his military experience, had prepared his legions with a precision that seemed unbeatable. On the morning of the final battle, the battlefield was tinged with a dark hue, filled with omens of an impending tragedy. Spartacus, knowing there were no more options, positioned himself at the front line with his best warriors. He wore his armor, stained with dirt and blood, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the sound of Roman trumpets grew louder, signaling the beginning of the confrontation. His men, exhausted and hungry, looked at him with a mix of respect and despair, but the leader never wavered. The battle began with indescribable violence. The Roman legions, disciplined and well-trained, advanced like an unrelenting wave, crushing any resistance they encountered. Spartacus, immersed in the brutality of the combat, fiercely attacked the Roman formations, leading his men with the determination that had been his trademark since his gladiator days. He seemed like a force of nature, defying death with each blow, but with every step, the siege closed in tighter. The Romans, with their numerical and tactical superiority, began to push the rebels back against an improvised defensive line. Spartacus, however, did not give up. He used the terrain to his advantage, organizing his men into guerrilla formations, attacking from all sides and creating confusion among the Roman legions. But Crassus's legions were relentless, and soon the fight turned into a massacre. Every fallen rebel fueled Rome's momentum, which now knew that victory was within reach. By the time afternoon came, The battlefield was covered in bodies, the earth stained with the blood of thousands. Spartacus, sword in hand and eyes fixed on his enemies, resisted, but knew the decisive moment was near. In one last act of courage, he charged at Crassus's forces, perhaps seeking a glorious death to seal his fight. However, even the legendary strength of Spartacus was not enough against the overwhelming wave of Rome. The battle ended with the complete victory of the Roman legions. Spartacus, the great rebel leader, was defeated. Some reports claim he fell in battle, surrounded by Romans, while others suggest he was captured and brought before Crassus. But one thing was certain: Spartacus's body was never found, and with that, countless legends about his final fate emerged. Some say he sacrificed himself to ensure the escape of his men. Others believe he fled to live anonymously, but the truth remains a mystery. The death of Spartacus not only marked the end of the slave revolt, but also the death of a symbol of resistance. However, his fight was never entirely in vain. Despite Rome's victory, Spartacus's rebellion left an indelible mark on the empire's history. The pain and sacrifice of thousands of men at the hands of Rome made the institution of slavery start to be viewed with new eyes, questioned in some parts of the empire. Spartacus's memory as a man who defied Rome's power spread, becoming a flame that would never be extinguished. His story, marked by bravery, an unrelenting fight for freedom, and determination in the face of oppression, would continue to inspire generations. Spartacus would become an icon, a symbol of resistance that transcended time and space, remembered by those who believed that the fight against injustice should never cease, even in the face of the greatest defeat. Although Spartacus's death marked the end of the slave revolt, his spirit did not extinguish with the blood shed on the battlefield. His name, echoing through the centuries, became an immortal symbol of resistance against oppression, a reminder that even the most oppressed can challenge the established powers and fight for freedom. In the years following Spartacus's defeat, Rome attempted to erase any trace of his rebellion. The Senate, in an attempt to demoralize slaves and peasants, made a point of displaying the crucified bodies of the rebels along the Appian Way, a road leading to Rome. But ironically, this only served to cement the myth of Spartacus. His courage, his tireless fight, and his dignified death transformed him into an almost legendary figure, revered by those who dreamed of freedom. For centuries, Spartacus became an icon in various cultures and social movements. In the Middle Ages, for example, he was depicted as a hero by the working class, who saw in his fight against Rome a fight against all tyrants. However, it was in the modern era that his figure was truly embraced by resistance movements. Leaders and groups fighting tyranny, slavery, and exploitation in different parts of the world began to draw inspiration from his story. From revolutionaries in France to liberation movements in Latin America, Spartacus was a figure who transcended borders and contexts. The Romans, in their attempt to destroy the image of the rebel leader, failed to realize they were feeding a flame that would never go out. Spartacus, the gladiator, the slave, the rebel commander, had become an eternal legend, more powerful than any Roman military force. He had proven, with his life and death, that the human can be stronger than the chains of oppression. His story has been retold in many forms over the centuries, in books, plays, films, and even in folk songs. Spartacus became a symbol not only of resistance, but also of hope that one day freedom would be won by those who desire it most. The echoes of his fight reached even the arts, inspiring filmmakers and writers to explore his story in productions that portrayed his struggle as a quest for justice against the cruel systems of his time. Moreover, Spartacus's impact was not limited to the realm of ideas and culture. His rebellion challenged the way Roman society viewed slaves and the lower classes. With Spartacus's revolt, it became clear that the institution of slavery was not something immutable. The Roman Empire, even after crushing the revolt, would begin to reconsider some of its policies, though very slowly. While the rebellion did not immediately result in the freedom of slaves, it sowed the idea that one day, the empire could be challenged by those in the shadows. Spartacus's legacy still resonates in contemporary movements that fight against oppression and social inequality. His ideals, tactics, and courage remain alive everywhere, where people still face injustice and seek a better future. Spartacus did not die. He became an idea, a force that challenges the powerful, an example that, even in the darkest moments, the flame of revolution never dies. The truth is that Spartacus was not just a leader of a revolt. He was an eternal symbol of the struggle for freedom and against tyranny. His name will be remembered as long as there are those who rise up against oppression, as long as there are those who believe that justice can triumph, even in the harshest of conditions. Spartacus's legacy, therefore, is not just a story from the past, but a living lesson for the present and the future. And so, we come to the end of our journey through the incredible story of Spartacus, the man who defied the most powerful empire of antiquity. His legacy, full of courage and resistance, is still alive today, inspiring those who fight for freedom and justice. If you were inspired by this story and want to continue exploring more fascinating historical figures, don't forget to leave your comment below. I'd love to know what you think about the Spartacus Revolt and how it impacted history. If you enjoyed this video, like and share so more people can discover this story of struggle and resistance. And of course, if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss any new content coming your way. See you in the next video, where we'll continue to explore the past and uncover other epic stories. Until then,